what people forget is that from the early 1800s up into the 1830s, there had been war across the North Island in particular and into the South Island from time to time on a truly massive scale. And thousands of Maori had perished as a result, and people had been moved from their historic sort of homelands, I guess you could say, and the whole of New Zealand had been thrown into turmoil by the arrival of the European military technology, which the Maori were very quick to adopt, and those who had the most of it exacted an awful toll on those who had the least. So what the treaty provided in a very real sense was a measure of protection. The Europeans, they knew, because many of their leaders had been to Europe and had seen for themselves, come back and told their people. The Europeans, and the British in particular, were enormously powerful and unbelievably numerous, and their technology was far superior in terms of killing power to anything the Maori had before they arrived. But the very killing power of that technology was threatening the existence of Maori as a people, or the tribes as coherent entities. So when the treaty promised the protection of Queen Victoria to those who signed up, that was a very real gain for them. That promised them a respite from the awful warfare that had thrown their whole culture into confusion. I mean, they'd fought themselves almost to a standstill by the 1830s, but there was no indication that similar bloodshed couldn't erupt again at any time. If a chief arose who had the weapons and the will, that was always on the cards. So the arrival of the Europeans, the signing of the treaty, the establishment of a colonial government, its arrival in Auckland, particularly for the Ngāti Whātua, who had come out in many ways the worse for wear as a result of the musket wars. And that would have been a very good thing. Maori, I think, failed to grasp, at least initially, the meaning of the granting of responsible government to the colony in the early 1850s. They had been used to dealing with the governor and his officials, and the governor was the direct representative of the British monarchy or the British state, from whom they drew their guarantee of protection. It wasn't immediately apparent to them, I think, that the establishment of a parliament in New Zealand, a legislature in any case, would pose a huge threat to them. I think it became obvious, and that may have spurred the creation of kingitanga, the king movement, as they sought to make their political institutions more coherent and more able to negotiate with this new power that was rising in Auckland as it happened. But essentially, they, I think, still clung to the notion that this super chieftain or chieftainess in Europe had guaranteed them their chieftainship, their tino rangatiratanga, the power of the chiefs. And the maintenance of the power of the chiefs was dependent upon the protection of that super chief in London. And when these other new chiefs arose in the legislature in Auckland, I don't think they adapted very successfully to that, because people like the merchant Thomas Russell and his allies very quickly realised the potential of mixing business and politics by getting into the parliament, by becoming ministers. They could essentially set up the Maori for a war which they couldn't win and which would result in wholesale confiscation of their lands. They had the precedent, which was really only a few decades old, of what had happened in Scotland, where the rebels, under Bonnie Prince Charlie, had their lands sequestrated by the Crown, how the clans had been driven, into political oblivion. All of this was relatively recent history for people who had come from Britain, and the template was there, and they followed it quite closely, as it turned out. I mean, the Scots and the Irish were no strangers to what they saw happening in New Zealand. So that early period when the government of New Zealand was based in Auckland was the beginning, I think, of a whole number of things. The involvement of Auckland business leaders in politics, not out of any great idealistic ambition, but purely for the commercial gain it could bring, and also the protection of the gains already won that politics would afford them. And the involvement of Auckland business leaders in New Zealand politics has been a constant from the 1860s to the present day. I mean, one only has to look at the people behind the plan for a super city, which is going to be one of the real milestones in Auckland's history, I believe. To see the same pattern. This is an idea that is driven by business, just as Thomas Russell drove the native and the land policies of the 1860s, with a clear intention, of advantaging Auckland business, seizing Maori land, and following that course of action through with real ruthlessness. So Auckland's beginnings, contain, much of the future history of New Zealand. It seems to me, in politics and race relations, and commerce, and it's interesting to look at the dynamic between Auckland and the other cities of New Zealand, because after the 1860s, when I think perhaps in response to the outrage that many contemporaries of Thomas Russell felt at the way he had used the government to advance his own and his mates' commercial interests, I think getting the seat of government out of Auckland became quite a high priority. Basically get it out of the hands of those guys, because they're ruthless crooks essentially, and down it went to Wellington, and Auckland's place in New Zealand after that faded a little, because gold was discovered in Otago and on the west coast, and so Dunedin prospered, Christchurch prospered, the South Island cities began to supply the political leadership, the ideas, the whole Liberal Party sort of reforms that came in the 1890s. A lot of the people who led those were South Islanders. They weren't North Islanders, and they certainly weren't Aucklanders. You've got to actually look at that dynamic, and the fact that Auckland wasn't that much bigger than Christchurch and Dunedin for a long time, and you can see in the way that Auckland business intruded itself into the political arena, to, in a sense, recapture the initiative for its city and for the North Island in particular. This has been a constant theme.